She had spent $14 million trying to make one engine turnover. 14 million, 7 years, 23 specialists flown in from 6 countries, and a car that still sat in the dark like something embalmed. The Lamborghini was the color of a struck match, and it had not made a sound in 7 years. Adrienne Vance could buy a building with a phone call. She could fire a man who'd worked for her for 2 decades between the appetizer and the entree and not lose her appetite. She could rebuild almost anything, except this. And on the gray October morning that finally cracked her open, the man who solved what no expert on earth could solve was the single father whose workshop she had stood in 2 weeks earlier and called, to his face, a junkyard. "Tell me where you're watching from. I have a feeling this one travels." There is a particular silence that lives inside a room built to hold a thing that no longer works. It is not the silence of a Sunday morning or the hush before snow. It is heavier than that. It has a texture. It settles on your shoulders when you walk in, and it follows you out, and you carry it around for the rest of the day without quite knowing why your chest feels tight. Adrienne Vance had learned over 7 years to stay out of the garage. In the beginning, she went in often. The first winter after the car went quiet, she would walk down the long-covered breezeway from the main house in her wool coat, push open the steel door, and stand beside the Lamborghini with one gloved hand resting flat on the hood the way you might rest your hand on the shoulder of someone who is grieving and has run out of words. The paint was a deep, furious orange, Arancio Miura. The factory had called it, though to her it had always just looked like the inside of a fire. It seemed to glow even in the cold, fluorescent light. It seemed some days like the only living thing in the building, even though it was the deadest thing she owned. By the second year, she stopped touching it. By the third, she had the staff polish the glass partition that separated the car from the rest of the climate-controlled space, and she gave them one instruction, delivered once, never repeated: do not speak to me about the car, not to update her, not to ask, not ever. By the fourth year, she routed her morning walk around the east wing of the property so she would not have to pass the garage at all. The path took 11 minutes longer. She walked it anyway every day in the dark, before the sun came up over the Sangre de Cristo foothills, because the 11 minutes were cheaper than the alternative. By the 7th year, every person who worked on the 80-acre estate outside Santa Fe knew, without being told, that you did not mention the orange car in front of Ms. Vance. Not because she had ever raised her voice about it. She had not. It was the other thing. The way her face changed when the subject got close. A kind of flattening. A light going out somewhere behind the eyes, the way a bulb dims for a half-second before it burns out for good. The estate itself was the sort that ended up photographed in magazines with one-word captions underneath. Refuge, Vision, Empire. Adrienne had bought it at 36, which had been its own small news event, the self-made logistics billionaire, the woman who had turned a single leased warehouse and a beat-up box truck into the largest privately held freight and fulfillment network west of the Mississippi, buying the kind of land that usually only changed hands between old families and oil money. The headlines treated the geography like it made the achievement more real, as if the address proved something the balance sheet couldn't. She was 43 now. She had been 36 when her brother died. 36 when the orange car went silent, in a manner of speaking, on the same August week. 36 when the two things that mattered most to her in the world both went quiet inside the same 7 days, and she had spent every year since then learning how to live in a house with one room she could not enter. Her brother's name was Marco. Marco Vance was 8 years older than Adrienne, and for most of her childhood he had been less like a brother and more like a roof, the thing over her head that kept the weather off. Their father had been a long-haul driver who came home 4 days a month and was, on balance, easier to love when he was gone. Their mother had worked the register at a truck stop diner outside Pueblo and had, in Adrienne's clearest memories, a permanent expression of someone doing arithmetic that never came out right. When Adrienne was 9 and Marco was 17, their mother's heart simply stopped one night between the dinner rush and closing, behind the counter, with a coffee pot in her hand. Their father lasted another 2 years on the road before a jackknife trailer on black ice outside Raton took him too. So it was Marco. From the time Adrienne was 11, Marco was a mechanic, not a famous one, not a rich one. He worked at, and then eventually bought on a handshake and a 15-year note, a 2-bay garage off the state highway in a town called Cordero that had been shrinking since the rail spur closed in 1981. He knew every customer by their first name and the sound of their alternator. He kept a coffee maker on a folding card table by the door for anyone who had to wait, and he refused to charge widows and schoolteachers full price, which his accountant hated and which he never once apologized for. He wore the same style of Navy work shirt every day of his life, with his name stitched in red thread above the left pocket. Marco. He smelled like cutting oil and lava soap, and on Friday evenings, like the single bottle of beer he allowed himself with his feet up on the workbench. He had enormous hands. Adrian used to think they belonged on a much bigger man, and those hands could find a fault in an engine the way a doctor reads a film, a flat, certain knowing that never needed to perform itself to be believed. He raised her on a mechanic's wages and a mechanic's hours. He showed up to every parent-teacher night smelling faintly of brake cleaner, in the one collared shirt he owned that wasn't a work shirt. He helped her with algebra at the kitchen table under a buzzing light, getting most of it wrong and refusing to admit it. He taught her to drive in the garage's loaner, a wheezing Buick, in the empty lot behind the grain elevator, and he gripped the dashboard so hard his knuckles went white and told her she was a natural even when she clipped a trash can. When she got into the university on a full ride, the first in the family to go past high school, he drove her the whole way in his own truck, a 1994 Chevy with 250,000 miles on it and a crack across the dash like a dry riverbed, and when he dropped her off he cried. Openly. Both hands on the steering wheel, head down, not bothering to hide it from the other families unloading their minivans. "You're gonna build something I can't even picture," he told her that day. "And I'm gonna get to watch." "Marco, stop," she'd said, mortified the way you only can be at 18, when love is offered to you plainly and your whole body flinches from the size of it. She would spend the rest of her life regretting the way she'd said stop. He bought the Lamborghini the year her company crossed its first billion in revenue. It was not a whim. Marco had been researching it for the better part of 2 years. Adrian found this out later, going through the browser history on the old laptop he kept in the garage office. Pages and pages of auction records and ownership forums and parts availability threads, studied with the same patience he gave to everything. He had never owned a single expensive thing in his life. He drove the Chevy until the frame rusted through. He bought his clothes at a farm supply store and considered the matter settled. But the Lamborghini. The Lamborghini was a 1974 Countach LP 400, the first real production version, the periscope roof car, the one with the impossible wedge shape that had hung on the bedroom wall of every kid who came of age in that decade, including a skinny mechanic's apprentice in Cordero, Colorado, who used to tape pictures of it inside his locker. The original Burton design. The 4-liter V12 sitting longitudinally behind the seats, fed by 6 Weber carburetors. A machine so absurd and beautiful that even people who knew nothing about cars would stop on a sidewalk to watch it go by. He paid $480,000 for it. At auction, on a phone bid Adrian helped him place because he didn't trust himself not to fumble it. For Marco, that number was the equivalent of a normal man spending every dollar he had ever saved on a single beautiful, impractical dream. He called her the night it cleared. "Nessa," he said, only he had ever called her that. "I went and did something." "Marco, what did you do?" "I bought a car." A silence on the line, then. "It's not a regular car." She had laughed so hard she'd had to put the phone down. He drove it twice, maybe 3 times. He was terrified of it, terrified of a stone chip, of a leak, of being the man who bought the car of his life and then broke it in a parking lot. He kept it at first in a rented storage unit, which Adrian found both hilarious and unbearable, and she finally talked him into letting her build him something proper. A small, clean, glass-fronted garage on the back acre of his own land, behind the shop, with climate control and good light and an epoxy floor in a shade of gray, he picked out himself and described, with total seriousness, as dignified. The car had been running perfectly the last time he started it. He died 11 months later. A massive coronary in the shop on a Tuesday afternoon, with a customer's transmission half out and the radio playing the classic country station he always had on. Which is, Adrian would eventually decide, the only mercy in the whole thing, that it happened there, surrounded by the smell and the sound of the only work he ever loved, with grease under his nails, doing the thing that had defined every day of his life. She flew home and spent 4 days in Cordero doing the things that grief makes you do. Sitting across from a funeral director who kept sliding a binder of casket options across the desk, calling people she hadn't spoken to in a decade. Accepting foil-covered dishes from neighbors whose names she'd forgotten. Sitting in her brother's small house surrounded by his objects, the recliner with the worn arm, the coffee mug in the sink, the work boots by the door still holding the shape of his feet, and feeling the obscene wrongness of a world that keeps spinning while you are standing absolutely still in the middle of it. On the last morning, she went into the glass garage behind the shop and sat on the dignified gray floor next to the orange Lamborghini for almost 3 hours. Then she had it shipped to Santa Fe. The first specialist arrived 6 weeks after the funeral. She did not expect it to be hard. That was the part that, looking back, embarrassed her most. She had assumed, with the flat confidence of someone who had never once been told no by a problem that money couldn't outspend, that she would have the car running by Christmas. She would learn to drive it properly, the way Marco never let himself, and she would take it out on the high desert roads at dawn. And somehow, in some way she didn't examine too closely, that would settle the account. It would be the thing she did for him. The promise she made to no one but herself, standing on that gray floor that felt more binding than any contract she had ever signed. I will make it run again. I will not let the last thing you loved go quiet. The first crew came from a marked specialist in Los Angeles. 4 technicians, all factory certified, one of them a former works mechanic who had turned wrenches for a European endurance team. They brought their own diagnostic rigs in a wrapped Sprinter van. They were, according to the firm's website, the foremost classic exotic restoration house on the West Coast. They spent 5 days with the car. The problem from the very beginning was strange. The engine was mechanically sound, astonishingly so for a car of its age. Compression was even across all 12 cylinders. The valvetrain was tight. The Weber carburetors had been freshly rebuilt by Marco himself, jets and floats immaculate. There was no reason on earth the engine should not start. And it would not start, it would not even fire. It would crank, that deep, unhurried churn of the big V12 turning over, and then nothing. No catch, no cough, no life. Every reading the crew took came back clean, which was the maddening part because the readings being clean meant the readings were lying. Something was wrong. Something was obviously wrong. And the fact that no instrument could find it meant the wrongness was hiding somewhere the instruments weren't built to look. The LA crew left without fixing it. They sent a 40-page report and an invoice for $200,000. Adrian understood perhaps a third of the report. She paid the invoice the same afternoon and called the next firm. Over the next 7 years, 23 separate teams put their hands on that car. Not all of them were serious. Some were clearly out of their depth and left red-faced after a single afternoon, having confidently announced a solution that did nothing. A few were genuinely brilliant. There was a man from Modena, an old factory engineer named Bruno, who had personally assembled engines like this one when he was a young man in the 70s, who spent 2 weeks living in the casita on the property and got closer than anyone. He isolated the fault to a single subsystem, a narrow band of the ignition and fuel delivery architecture. Before he hit a wall he could not climb. He called Adrian to tell her so himself in heavily accented English, which she respected more than she could say, because he was the only one in 7 years who told her the truth to her face instead of hiding behind a binder. "The car," Bruno said, "she is not standard. Someone has changed her. Not badly, beautifully, even. Whoever did this work, he knew exactly what he was doing, but it makes a blind spot. The machines, they look for what they expect. They do not see what has actually been made different. So what do we do?" Adrian said, a long pause on the line. "I do not know," the old man said. "I am sorry. For the first time in 40 years, I do not know." She paid him 3 times his quote. There were others she would remember in fragments, the way you remember bad weather. A celebrated restoration shop from England flew in a team of 5 with a shipping container of equipment and a contract thick as a phone book. And after 9 days, their lead, a polished man who wore driving gloves indoors, told her, with the wounded dignity of someone unaccustomed to losing, that the car had a personality disorder, which was the closest any of them came to admitting the truth, which was that they could not do it. A pair of brothers from Texas who built engines for vintage racing and had never once been beaten swore they'd have it lit in a weekend. They stayed 11 days, slept in the casita, grew quiet and then grim, and left without taking her check, which she later understood was the most honest thing anyone had done. A famous electrical specialist from Japan, a small, precise man who spoke almost no English and needed none, mapped the entire wiring loom by hand onto a roll of paper 12 feet long, taped it to the garage wall, stared at it for 2 days, and then bowed to her deeply and said the one English sentence he'd clearly prepared. "I am sorry. The car keeps its secret." She had thought about that sentence for years afterward. The car keeps its secret. He'd been closer to the truth than any of the men with the bigger machines, and he hadn't even known it. And the readings always came back clean. That was the thing that broke the spirit of every crew in turn. There was nothing to fix, which meant there was nothing to point a tool at, which meant each team eventually arrived at the same wall, scratched at it, and went home. A few of them on the way out suggested gently that perhaps the car simply didn't want to run, the way superstitious people talk about a haunted house. And Adrian had wanted to scream at them because she did not believe in haunted houses. She believed in causes. And a cause that 22 of the best minds in the world could not find was not a ghost. It was a humiliation with no face. The car sat. By the start of the 7th year, the running total of the failed repairs, when you added it all up, the specialists, the shipping crates, the custom one-off diagnostic tools 2 different firms had built specifically for this car and which still hadn't cracked it, the parts ordered and installed and then removed, the hotel bills, the translators, came to a little over $14 million. $14 million meant nothing to Adrian Vance in any way that mattered to her bank. Her net worth, depending on the quarter and the markets, floated somewhere north of $9 billion. She had lost more than $14 million on a single misjudged acquisition in her late 30s and barely registered the dent. The money was never the point. The money had never once been the point. The point was that she was failing at the one thing in her entire life she had promised she would not fail at. Every dead crew was another installment of the same private humiliation. Every phone call with another world-renowned expert who had run dry of ideas was a small defeat she filed away with the others. Adrian Vance, who had built a logistics empire from a leased warehouse, who had been profiled in every business magazine that printed, who had stared down activist investors and federal regulators and a hostile board and never once blinked, could not start her dead brother's car. Some mornings, driving the golf cart back from the garage after another pointless visit, she would be halfway up the hill to the house before she realized her jaw was clenched so hard her back teeth ached. The 23rd team was supposed to be the end of it. They came in late September. They brought more equipment than any crew before them, 2 trucks, a generator the size of a chest freezer, climate sensors they zip-tied to the rafters. Their lead was a Swiss engineer named Dr. Stefan Roth, who had published the definitive academic papers on vintage Italian ignition systems, and who had the unhurried, faintly amused confidence of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room he entered. He walked around the Lamborghini 3 full times before he so much as touched it, hands clasped behind his back, the way a curator circles a painting before deciding what it's worth. "I have read all of it," he said to Adrian, nodding at the file boxes. 22 teams, an extraordinary record of failure. I will be honest with you, that record actually helps me. It rules out a great deal. Whatever the answer is, it will be something genuinely new. That is the only kind of problem worth my time. "How long?" Adrian said. 3 weeks, perhaps a month. He lasted 11 days. On the morning of the 12th, Adrian came down to the garage and found Dr. Roth standing outside it. Not inside with the car. Outside on the gravel, hands in his pockets, looking at the orange shape through the glass partition with an expression she had come to know intimately over 7 years. Not quite embarrassment, adjacent to it. The look of a man whose entire professional identity was built on being the last resort, standing at the edge of the limit of that identity. Behind him, his crew was rolling the big generator back up the ramp into the truck. "Dr. Roth," he turned. He took off his glasses, polished them with the hem of his shirt, put them back on, a delaying gesture. "Ms. Vance, I must tell you that I cannot solve this." She had heard the sentence 22 times. It still landed like a fist under the ribs. "I have identified every component that should, in theory, be responsible," he said, slipping into the flat register of a man delivering bad news for a living. "None of them is the actual cause. The fault lives somewhere in the interaction between systems, a cascade I can measure the effects of but not the origin of. And without the origin, any repair I attempt is a guess. Guessing on a system this delicate risks doing real harm. I am not willing to do harm to this car." He paused. "I am sorry. The previous teams were right to fail. There is something in here that does not want to be found by people like us." Adrian looked past him through the glass at the car. The morning light was coming in low and sideways across the desert, and it caught the orange paint and made it burn, made it look impossibly, painfully alive for something that had been silent for 7 years. "Thank you for your time," she said, flat, professional. She had gotten very good at this particular voice. She waited until the trucks had crunched down the long drive and out the gate before she let herself go back into the garage and sit on the floor. And it was sitting there, on the gray epoxy that Marco's car deserved, and that this estate's floor was a poor imitation of, with 7 years of failure stacked around her in file boxes, that her assistant's text came through. A name. A phone number. A man 2 states away who, the message said, some of the old vintage guys swear is the best there is, but he doesn't advertise, doesn't have a website, won't fly anywhere, and apparently runs the whole thing out of some shop in the middle of nowhere in Ohio. Adrian almost deleted it. Then she looked at the car one more time, the dead orange shape in the cold light, and she thought about the promise, and she texted back a single word. Address. Halford, Ohio, did not appear on most maps, and the ones it did appear on tended to misspell it. It sat in the flat farm country an hour south of nowhere, a grid of 8 streets around a grain elevator and a shuttered hardware store and a diner that had changed names 4 times but never closed. A single set of railroad tracks ran along the north edge of town, and a freight line still came through twice a day, long and slow and patient, dragging its low horn across the field so that you heard it coming for 2 full minutes before you saw it. People in Halford set their watches by it. The 6:50, the 4:20. The sound was so constant that newcomers couldn't sleep and locals couldn't sleep without it. Adrienne flew into Columbus on her own plane, had a car drive her the rest of the way, and arrived at Cole Renner's workshop a little before 11 on a gray Tuesday in early October with the specific impatience of a woman who has cleared exactly 90 minutes in her calendar for what she has already decided is a waste of time. The shop was at the end of a gravel road on the edge of town, and her first thought, looking at it through the car window, was that someone had played a joke on her. It was an old steel-sided machine shed, long and low, with a corrugated roof streaked orange-brown with rust and a faded sign over the main bay that read simply RENNER, repair and restoration in hand-painted letters that had been touched up so many times the strokes had gone fat. The yard around it was a chaos of metal, engine blocks on pallets. A row of fenders leaned against the fence like dominoes. The hulk of a 1950s pickup with no wheels, sunk to its axles in weeds. Stacks of tires, a wall of shelving, outdoors and half under a tarp, holding 1,000 parts she couldn't begin to identify, sorted in a system that was either genius or madness. 2 dogs of indeterminate breed slept in a patch of weak sun by the door and did not lift their heads when she got out. She stood on the gravel in shoes that cost more than the truck rotting in the weeds, and she felt the 90 minutes she'd allotted curdle into something closer to 40. A man came out of the main bay wiping his hands on a red rag. He was tall, 6'2", maybe, and built the way men are built by actual work rather than gyms, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with forearms that showed the cabling of someone who used them all day, and a few permanent gray smudges worked so deep into the knuckles they'd never fully wash out. He had dark hair gone slightly long, a few days of stubble, and an unreadable steadiness to him. He wore a navy work shirt and something twisted briefly in Adrienne's chest at the sight of it, because it was so close to the shirts Marco used to wear, though she pushed the thought down before it could surface fully. There was no name stitched on this one, just a faded oval where one used to be. He looked at her. He looked at the car she'd come in. He looked back at her and waited, which most people did not do. Most people filled the air. "Mr. Renner," she said. "Adrienne Vance, we spoke on the phone." They had not spoken, her assistant had. She corrected herself without missing a beat. "My office spoke with you." "They did." He had a low, even voice. "You're early. I value other people's time, so I assume they value mine." She said it crisply, and she meant it as a courtesy, and she heard, a half-second too late, how it actually landed. She let it stand anyway. She did not, as a rule, walk things back. He just nodded slightly, as if filing it. "You want to come in or you want to do this in the yard?" She looked past him into the open bay, and what she saw did not improve her mood. It was clean enough, she'd give it that. The concrete floor was swept, the tools were on the walls in their shadows outlines, but it was full. Every surface held a project. A motorcycle in pieces on a bench. An engine, ancient and intricate, suspended from a chain hoist like an anatomical specimen. A workbench buried under carburetors and a coffee can of bolts, and a child's drawing taped to the pegboard above it. The whole place had the dense, layered, lived-in chaos of a space where one person did the work of 10, and never threw anything away. And Adrienne Vance, who was tired, and who had just driven 2 states to the recommendation of some of the old vintage guys, and who had buried a brother and failed 23 times and slept 4 hours, made the mistake she would spend a long time paying for. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Renner," she said, and she let her eyes travel slowly around the bay, the yard, the rust, the dogs, the leaning fenders, the sunken truck. "I have a $480,000 automobile that the best engineers in the world could not repair, and I've come a very long way to stand in what is, with respect, a junkyard." She turned back to him. "So I need you to tell me quickly why I shouldn't get back in the car." The word hung there in the cold air. Junkyard. One of the dogs sighed in its sleep. Cole Renner looked at her for a long moment, not angry. That was the thing she'd remember. A flash of something moved across his face and was gone, not hurt exactly, something older and more tired than hurt. And then his expression simply closed, the way a door closes when someone on the other side decides the conversation is over. "You're right," he said. "You shouldn't," she blinked. "I beg your pardon." "You drove a long way to insult a man's shop," he said in the same even tone, folding the red rag into a careful square. I'd hate for the trip to be a waste, so let me save you the rest of it. I don't take work from people who already decided what I am before they shook my hand. Wouldn't matter how good the car is. Wouldn't matter how good the check is. He nodded toward her waiting car. Drive safe. There's a diner on the square if you want coffee before you get back on the highway. The pie's better than it has any right to be. And he turned around and walked back into the junkyard, and the steel door rolled down behind him with a long, final rattle, and Adrienne Vance was left standing alone in the gravel for the first time in longer than she could remember, with absolutely no idea what to do next. She did not drive back to the highway. She told herself she meant to. She got in the car and she told the driver to take her to the airport in Columbus, and she got about 4 miles before she said, "Pull over," and sat on the shoulder of a county road between 2 harvested cornfields with the engine running and her hands flat on her knees, and tried to understand why she was shaking. It was not the insult to her. People had said far worse things to Adrienne Vance, and she had eaten them for breakfast. It was the other thing. It was that for 7 years, every man who'd touched that car had wanted something from her: the prestige of the job, the size of the check, the story they'd get to tell at industry dinners about the impossible Vance Countach. They had all said yes before they understood the car at all, because the yes was worth money to them. And this one had said no. This one had looked at her like she was the one being tested, and had failed her, and had walked away from $480,000, and whatever she'd have paid on top of it without so much as a backward glance. Over a single word, over the principle of the thing, over a junkyard he clearly loved. Marco would have done exactly that, she thought, and the thought arrived with such force that she had to press the heels of her hands into her eyes. Marco had once thrown a man out of his shop, a wealthy man from Denver with a vintage Porsche, for snapping his fingers at him. "I don't come when I'm whistled for," Marco had said. "Find somebody who does." She sat on the shoulder of the road for 20 minutes. Then she told the driver to turn around. The freight train was coming through when they got back. She heard it before she saw the workshop, that long, low horn dragging itself across the flat fields, and then the slow thunder of it, car after car after car, so that she had to wait at the crossing on the edge of town for what felt like a small geological age. By the time the gravel road came back into view, she had rehearsed and discarded 4 different things to say. She didn't get to use any of them because when she pulled up, Cole Renner was not in the shop. He was crouched in the gravel of the yard next to a child. The child was a boy, 8 or 9, in a coat too big for him and rubber boots, and he was holding something out on his palm with the grave seriousness of a museum docent, and Cole was looking at it with an attention so complete and unhurried that for a second Adrienne forgot she had come to say anything at all. She got out of the car quietly. Neither of them looked up. "It's a ladybug," the boy was saying, "but it's the orange kind, not the red kind, and it has way more spots than a regular one, so I think it might be a different species, or it could be a mutation." "Could be either," Cole said. "How would you find out?" "Look it up, count the spots." The boy frowned. "But she keeps moving, so I keep losing count. So put her somewhere safe and count the picture." The boy considered this with the air of a man receiving genuinely useful counsel, then carefully transferred the ladybug to a leaf, took out an actual disposable camera, the kind Adrienne hadn't seen in 20 years, and photographed it. It was the camera that did it. The cheap yellow disposable camera in a 9-year-old's hands in the year they were living in. It told her all at once several things about the economics of the man who'd thrown her out, and she felt the junkyard reassemble itself in her mind into something else entirely, not a junkyard, but a living, a hard one, careful, threadbare living with a child in it. "Mr. Renner," she said. Cole stood, and his hand came to rest on the boy's shoulder, light, automatic, a gesture so reflexive he plainly didn't know he was doing it. The boy looked up at her with frank, unguarded curiosity, the kind children have before the world teaches them to perform a face for strangers. "You came back," Cole said, not warm, not cold, an observation. "I came back to apologize," she said, and the words came out stiff, rusted, because she did not say them often and was out of practice. "I called your shop a junkyard." That was, she stopped, made herself find the accurate word instead of the easy one, the way she'd have demanded from anyone working for her. That was cruel, and it was wrong, and I knew it was wrong while I was saying it, and I said it anyway because I was tired and I was losing and I wanted someone to be smaller than me for 30 seconds. "You weren't. That's on me. I'm sorry." The boy looked up at his father, eyebrows raised, plainly impressed by the production. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said, "just that. No grace note, no don't worry about it." He took the apology at exactly its weight and no more, which she found she respected enormously. "Who's that?" the boy asked, meaning her. This is Ms. Vance, Cole said. Ms. Vance, this is Sam, my son, who is supposed to be doing the spelling list I left him, not conducting field biology. I did half the spelling list, Sam said. Biology is a reward. Biology is not a reward, it's a subject. It can be both. Sam turned to Adrian with the directness of the very young. Are you the lady with the orange Lamborghini? Dad said a lady came about an orange Lamborghini. Adrian looked at Cole. Something passed across his face. He hadn't expected the boy to have heard that. I am, she said. A Countach, Sam pronounced it correctly, Countach, which almost no one did. The LP400 with the periscope. She crouched down without quite deciding to, so she was at the boy's level. Yes, she said. Exactly that one. How do you know about the periscope? Dad has a book. Sam said it like it was obvious. It won't start, right? That's what Dad said. He said the lady's got a car that won't start and the best guys in the world couldn't figure it out and she came all the way here. That's right. The boy looked at his father with an expression of pure, uncomplicated faith, the look of a child who has not yet learned that there are things his parent cannot do. Dad could figure it out, Sam said to Adrian as a simple statement of fact about the universe. Dad can fix anything. He fixed Mrs. Petrak's whole tractor and the John Deere guy said it was dead. Adrian stood back up slowly. She looked at Cole Renner, at the closed, careful face, the navy shirt, the gray ground into the knuckles, the leaning fenders, the rusted roof, the dogs, the disposable camera, the shop with one project on every surface and a child's drawing taped over the workbench. And for the first time since she'd buried her brother, some old instinct she'd thought she'd lost, the one that had let a girl from Cordero look at a single leased warehouse and see a continent-spanning network where everyone else saw a leaky roof, woke up and stretched. Mr. Renner, she said. I'd like to start over. I'd like to ask you to look at the car, not fix it. I'm not asking you to promise anything. Just look at it. I will pay you for your time at whatever rate insults you the least, and if you tell me it can't be done, I will believe you because you'll be the 24th person to tell me, and I'm running out of people on Earth who are better than you're apparently supposed to be. Cole studied her for a long moment. It's not here, he said finally. The car. It can be here by Thursday. He looked down at his son, who was looking back up at him with the unbearable, weightless hope of the very young, and Adrian understood that the boy had already decided, and that the boy got a vote, and that this was a household where that was simply how things worked. Bring it Thursday, Cole said. I'll look, no promises, and I don't work for people who whistle. I don't whistle, Adrian said. We'll see. The car arrived on a flatbed at 7 in the morning on Thursday, and half of Halford found a reason to be on the gravel road that day. That was not an exaggeration. The diner emptied. A man Adrian later learned ran the grain elevator drove past 4 separate times. Mrs. Petrak of the resurrected tractor brought a plate of cinnamon rolls for the driver and stayed 2 hours. Word travels in a town of 8 streets, and the word was that the strange orange car from the magazines, the one the richest woman anyone had ever seen had come about, was going to live in Cole Renner's shed for a while. Adrian had flown back out, against the advice of every part of her schedule, because she found she could not stand the idea of the car arriving and her not being there. She watched from the edge of the yard as the flatbed driver winched it down, and she saw the exact moment Cole Renner first really looked at it. He'd been standing with his arms crossed, unhurried, while the straps came off. And then the Countach rolled the last few feet down the ramp and settled onto the gravel, orange and impossible against the rust and the gray Ohio sky, and Cole went very still. It was not the stillness of being impressed. She had watched men be impressed by this car for 7 years. She knew that stillness, and it had a performance in it, a glance around to see who was watching. This was different. This was the stillness of someone hearing a piece of music they hadn't heard since they were young and being surprised by how much of it they still knew. Huh, he said softly, to himself, not to her. He walked around it once, then again. He did not touch it. On the third pass, he crouched at the rear and looked at the engine cover for a long time without opening it, and then he stood and finally turned to her. Who modified it? He asked. Adrian felt the back of her neck go cold. What? This car's been changed. He said it plainly, the way you'd say a car was blue. Not wrecked, not bodged, changed carefully by somebody who really knew it. He nodded at the rear deck. The hardware on the engine cover latch isn't factory. Whoever did it matched it close, but it's not factory. People don't change one bolt unless they were in there changing a lot of other things. She stared at him. In 7 years, exactly one man, old Bruno from Modena, had said the car had been modified at all, and he'd needed 2 weeks and a borescope to suspect it. Cole Renner had found it in 3 slow laps around the car with his hands in his pockets from the latch bolts. My brother, she heard herself say. The word came out before she decided to spend it. My brother modified it. He was a mechanic. She stopped. He's the one who couldn't be here to start it. Cole Renner looked at her differently then. Not pity, she'd have hated pity, something steadier than that. He'd heard the word was the way she had once heard it about Marco from 100 careful people, and she could see him deciding in real time not to step around it. What was his name? Cole asked. People didn't ask that. They referenced the loss without touching the dead person directly, as if the name itself were live current. Marco had taught her, by being dead, how rare it was for anyone to simply ask. Marco, she said. Then let's see what Marco did, Cole said, and he opened the engine cover. He worked alone, which she had not expected. Every one of the 23 teams before him had worked in crews, consulting tablets, calling supervisors, narrating their competence to the room. Cole Renner pulled a battered red rolling toolbox over, a snap-on, she noticed, the only thing in the shop that looked like it had cost real money, scuffed soft at every corner from a working life, and a single lead inspection lamp, and he got down beside the engine and he simply began to look. That was the only word for it. He looked. He ran his bare fingers along wiring looms beneath the intake the way a blind man reads a face. He'd pull a length of harness gently into the light and turn it and study it and set it back. He took the engine bay carpet up carefully, labeling where each clip went with a strip of blue painter's tape and a pencil, and looked under it. He didn't crank the engine. Not once that first day. He'd been told by her assistant that 23 teams had cranked it raw 1,000 times between them, and he said almost to himself, no point making it tired. At one point he lay flat on his back, half under the rear of the car, completely motionless for 40 minutes. Are you all right? Adrian asked, and regretted it instantly. Thinking, Cole said. You've been still for 40 minutes. It's a 40-minute thought. Sam was there after school, doing homework on an overturned milk crate with a board across it for a desk, the two dogs arranged around him like furniture. It was a quiet presence in the way only children raised in close quarters with a working adult learn to be, present, self-contained, occasionally surfacing to ask a question of exactly the right size. Dad, what's the most spots a ladybug can have? Don't know, look it up. The internet here is too slow. Then it's a mystery and you'll have to make peace with it, Cole said from under the car, and Sam sighed the world-weary sigh of a boy denied and went back to his spelling. Adrian stayed all day. She told herself she'd stay an hour. She had a video board call she took standing in the corner of a stranger's machine shed in Ohio, with one finger in her ear against the sound of the 420 freight going by, watching a man she'd insulted 4 days earlier read her dead brother's wiring with his fingertips. When the call ended, her chief financial officer asked where on earth she was. She said, following up on something, and hung up, and could not have explained it to him if she'd tried. I'll have someone bring you food, she said to Sam at one point because the boy had been working a long time. We brought sandwiches, Sam said. Dad makes grilled cheese on the camp stove in the truck. He does it with the crust still on, which is correct because the crust is the best part. People who cut the crust off are cowards. From under the car, Cole made a sound that might have been a laugh. It's true, Sam said, unbothered. The first day ended with nothing fixed and Cole more certain than ever that something had been changed. He sent her a one-line text that night. The first contact they'd had that didn't go through her office. Found 3 of Marco's changes so far, all of them improvements. He was good, coming in early tomorrow. She read it sitting alone at the kitchen counter of the house she was staying at, and she read it 4 times, and the part that undid her was not coming in early. It was he was good. She didn't sleep much that night. She sat at the kitchen counter of the rented house with the lights off and the text on her phone, and she let herself remember things she'd spent 7 years not remembering. Not the funeral, not the hospital, but the small, ordinary ones, which were always the ones that ambushed you. Marco at the card table by the door of his shop, pouring coffee for a farmer who couldn't pay, waving off the money. Marco's enormous hands threading a tiny circlip onto a shaft, delicate as a surgeon. Marco at the kitchen table getting her algebra wrong with total confidence. The way he hummed when he worked, always the same 3 or 4 bars of something she could never name, a tuneless private music that meant he was happy and concentrating, that meant the world was, for the length of the song, exactly as it should be. She realized, sitting there, that she had not let herself picture his face in detail in years. She had kept him at the precise blurred distance that didn't hurt. And one stranger's 6-word verdict had reached past 7 years of careful distance and put her brother's hands back in front of her, threading that tiny circlip, humming his 4 bars, and she had not known until that moment how badly she'd needed someone to simply confirm that he had been real and skilled and worth all of this. The next morning she drove into Halford early and stopped at the diner on the square, because she could not yet make herself go straight to the shop and risk the day not happening. She ordered coffee and, on the waitress's solemn recommendation, a slice of the pie, which was, Cole had been right, far better than it had any business being. A sour cherry thing with a crust that shattered correctly. The waitress, a woman named Dot who had clearly already heard everything, refilled the cup without being asked and said, "You're the orange car lady," not unkindly. "Cole'll get it. Cole gets everything. Fixed my boy's transmission for $40 when the dealer wanted $2,000, and when I tried to give him more he wouldn't take it. Said the 40 was for parts and the rest was none of my business." Dot topped off the coffee a second time. "There's people in this town owe that man their whole lives, and he won't let a one of us say so out loud. So," she set the pot down, "you be good to him whatever this is." Adrian paid for the pie, left a tip that probably started a small rumor, and drove the last gravel mile to the shop with Dot's sentence sitting in her chest like a stone she didn't mind carrying. Nobody had told her that her brother was good in 7 years. They'd called the modifications a blind spot, an anomaly, a complicating factor. This stranger in a junkyard had spent one day with Marco's hands and called him good, the way one craftsman recognizes another across the years and across death, and Adrienne Vance put her face in her hands at her kitchen counter and cried for the first time in longer than she could remember. He came back at 5:30 the next morning. She knew because she'd told the gate to text her, and she'd lain awake to feel it. By the time she got down to the shop a little after 6, the freight train's early horn just fading off east, Cole had every one of the 6 Weber carburetors off the engine and laid out on a clean white shop towel in a precise row, like organs on a surgical tray. He was bent over them with a magnifying lamp and a set of jeweler's drivers, and Sam was asleep on a cot in the corner of the office. A cot, she realized, that had been set up on purpose, because the boys' school didn't start till 8 and his father started at 5, and this was simply how the arithmetic of a single parent with no money for a sitter resolved itself. "Don't hover," Cole said without turning around. She felt heat in her face. "I wasn't, there's a stool by the bench. You've been standing in doorways for 2 days. It's making my neck hurt for you." She sat on the stool. She watched him work for 3 hours. She, who did not sit still, who took meetings on treadmills and considered patients a tax, sat on a stool in a freezing machine shed and watched a man take her brother's carburetors apart, and she found she did not want to be anywhere else on earth. He narrated almost nothing, but every so often he'd hold something up to the lamp and say a quiet sentence, half to her and half to the work, and she came to understand that this was how he thought out loud in fragments the way Marco used to. "These Webers," he said at one point, turning a body in the light, "people think they're temperamental. They're not. They're honest. They do exactly what you set them to. If they're running rough, it's because somebody asked them to, even if they didn't mean to." He set it down. "Your brother set these perfectly. Whoever came after just kept changing things that were already right because the car wouldn't start and they had to do something. You can see it, 3 different people's idea of a fix stacked on top of work that was already correct. First thing I'm doing is undoing everybody else, putting it back the way Marco had it. Then I'll find out what Marco actually did." It took him most of the morning just to undo, to reverse 7 years of well-meaning, expensive, wrong interventions, to peel the car back, layer by layer, to the last state in which her brother's own hands had left it. He kept a running list on a yellow legal pad of every change he reversed, dated and described, so that, he said, if he turned out to be wrong about any of it, he could put it back exactly. She watched him work with a tenderness toward the machine that she had not seen in any of the 23 crews, none of whom had treated the car as anything but a problem with their reputation attached to it. Cole treated it as a thing a dead man had loved. By mid-morning the engine was, for the first time in 7 years, exactly as Marco had last left it. And then Cole stopped undoing and started looking, and the looking is what found it. And somewhere in the 3rd hour he stopped. He'd been examining the float bowl of the rearmost carburetor under the lamp, turning it slowly, and he went still, the now familiar stillness. And he reached for a pencil-thin pick and probed something inside it, and he made a low sound, not a word, more like a person recognizing a face in a crowd. "What?" Adrian said. "What is it?" He didn't answer for a moment. "Then your brother left you a message." "What?" Cole set the float bowl down very gently on the white towel and turned it so she could see, and beckoned her over with 2 fingers, and held the magnifying lamp so the light fell right. Inside the brass float bowl, on a surface no one would ever see unless they took the entire carburetor apart and looked at exactly the wrong-seeming place, a tiny set of letters had been hand-scribed into the metal with an engraver's tool, in a careful, blocky hand. The shop was very quiet. Somewhere far off, the long horn of the morning's second freight began to lift across the fields. "He knew," Cole said quietly. "He knew he was giving it to you someday. He hid it where only someone who tore the whole thing down to the studs would ever find it. Which is," he stopped, and she watched him put it together, and she watched something move behind his eyes that she didn't understand yet, which is also why nobody could start it. Hang on. He stood up fast, suddenly urgent, and crouched back at the engine and traced a fuel line she'd watched 23 teams trace before and followed it to a junction and looked at the junction, and then he laughed, short, disbelieving, delighted. He built a kill, Cole said. Right here. Marco built a kill into the fuel system. It's beautiful. It's the most stubborn, sneaky, loving piece of work I've ever seen. He looked up at her, his whole closed face cracked wide open with the joy of it. Your brother didn't want this car to start for just anybody. He said it so it won't run unless one specific thing gets done in one specific way at startup. A little sequence, totally non-standard, that he never wrote down anywhere because the only person he ever planned to teach it to was me, Adrian whispered. Was you. It took Cole the rest of that day and most of the next to be sure. He would not rush it, and she stopped asking him to. He explained it to her once plainly, the way Marco used to explain things, not talking down, just making it clear. The previous teams had all assumed the car was broken. It was not broken. It was guarded. Marco had reworked the fuel and ignition so that a hidden, deliberate fault sat in the startup path, a fault that looked, to every diagnostic tool on Earth, exactly like a real failure, because Marco had been clever enough to make his lock indistinguishable from a breakdown. The machine saw a fault and chased it. There was no fault to fix. There was only a sequence to perform, a specific order of operations, a particular thing done with the ignition and the fuel enrichment in a particular rhythm. That told the car it was being started by the one person it had been waiting for. Every team that came before saw a problem, Cole said. There was never a problem. There was a password. And the man who said it built it, so the only way to ever find it was to love the car enough to take it completely apart, one piece at a time, looking not for what was wrong but for what had been made. That's the difference. They were all looking for a fault. I was looking at what your brother did. How did you know to look at it that way? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, wiping a wrench that was already clean. That's a longer conversation, he said. I have time. He glanced at the office where Sam was doing homework with one dog's head in his lap. Not in front of him, he said quietly. She let it go. On the morning of the 6th day, he told her it was ready. He told her oddly, gently. He didn't announce it. She came in at 6 and the carburetors were back on, gleaming, and the engine bay was buttoned up, the painter's tape gone, every clip back in its labeled place, and Cole was standing by the driver's door with the look of a man who has wrapped a gift and is nervous about whether it fits. I can start it for you, he said. I figured out the sequence. I can turn the key and it'll run, and that's a fine way to do it. He paused. Or I can teach you the sequence, the way he'd have taught you. And you can be the one to start it. He held out the key. He scribed for Nessa inside it. Seems to me he had a vote about whose hand turns it. Adrian looked at the key in his oil-stained palm. She had failed 23 times. She had spent $14 million and 7 years not to fix a car, but to make one specific sound happen, one more time, in a world that no longer had her brother in it. And here was a single father from a town that didn't make the maps, holding out the key and offering her not the sound but the making of it. The thing Marco had actually left her, which was never the car at all but the chance to be taught one last thing by him, through the hands of a stranger. Teach me, she said. He taught her. It took 20 minutes and it was not complicated once you knew it. A small choreography of choke and pump and a held breath and a turn, and Marco's whole heart was in the strangeness of it. When she had it, Cole stepped back and Sam came out of the office and stood in the doorway in his too big coat, and the two dogs lifted their heads, and the only sound was the wind moving the tarp on the parts shelves outside. Adrian Vance got into her dead brother's Lamborghini. The smell hit her first. Old leather and fuel and a deeper thing underneath it that lived in the part of her memory that didn't use words. The part that still, after 30 years, held the smell of Marco's shop, of cutting oil and lava soap, of being 11 years old and safe in a town that was disappearing. She put both hands on the small, thick wheel. She did the choreography exactly the way she'd been taught Marco's choreography, Marco's hands inside her hands across 7 years and 1 death, and on the held breath she turned the key. The starter churned, once, twice, and then 4 liters of Italian V12 that had not spoken in 7 years caught and roared and lived. There is no other word for the sound it made. It was not a start. It was not a turnover. It was a full-throated, chest-cracking, building-shaking roar that rolled out of that machine shed and across the harvested fields and over the railroad tracks and out into the gray Ohio morning. And it held for 3 seconds before she got off the throttle. And in those 3 seconds, Adrian Vance, who had buried a brother without breaking in public because he'd have found it embarrassing, who had stared down a hostile board and never blinked, who had not let one single person see her cry since the day they put Marco in the ground, came completely apart. She sat in the running car with both hands on the wheel and sobbed. Not the tidy, controlled grief she sometimes allowed herself alone. The other kind. The kind that doesn't care that the door is open and a child is watching and a stranger is standing 3 feet away. The engine idled under her, a deep rolling thunder she felt in her sternum and the soles of her feet and somewhere behind her eyes, and the whole shed smelled like every good thing she'd lost, and she put her forehead against the wheel of Marco's car and let 7 years come out of her all at once. Cole Renner did not tell her it was okay. He did not ask if she needed anything. He did not perform the discomfort that most people perform when they accidentally witness someone else's bare grief. He just let her have it. He stood quietly by the open door while the V12 idled, and Sam watched from the doorway with the grave understanding of a child who has been close to adult grief before and learned to give it room. And the morning light came thin and gray through the dirty shop windows. And a man who'd been called the owner of a junkyard 6 days earlier kept watch over a billionaire weeping in an orange car, and asked nothing of her at all. When it finally passed, the way crying always passes, not cleanly, just with the slow exhaustion of something held too long, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, which accomplished nothing, and looked up at him through the open door. "I'm sorry," she started. "That wasn't you're in your own car," Cole said. "Listening to your brother, don't apologize for that, not to me, not to anybody." The engine rolled on under her hands. "For Nessa, run her hard." "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. The same plain register he gave to everything. No deflection. No, it was nothing. He took the thank you at its full weight, the way he'd taken her apology, and somehow that made it land truer than any speech could have. From the doorway, Sam said, "Dad, Dad, it sounds like a dragon." "It does," Cole agreed. "Can we hear it again?" Adrian laughed, wet and ragged and surprised out of her, and revved it once more gently, and the dragon roared, and Sam's whole face lit up like the 4th of July. And the 2 dogs bolted for the door, and somewhere out past the tracks the world went on being gray and flat and ordinary, indifferent to the fact that in one rusted shed at the end of a gravel road, something that had been broken for 7 years was, against all reasonable expectation, running. The story should have ended there. It did not, because stories about money and mystery and an impossible thing made possible do not stay in rusted sheds in towns that aren't on the map. Mrs. Petrak had filmed it. She had been standing at the edge of the yard with the last of her cinnamon rolls when the V12 lit, and she had her phone out, the way everyone has their phone out now. And the clip she posted, 40 seconds of an orange Lamborghini roaring to life in a machine shed, while a woman in a $1,000 coat wept over the wheel, and a little boy in the doorway jumped up and down, did, in the language of these things, numbers. By Friday afternoon, it had 3 million views. By Saturday, it had the kind of headline that writes itself. Billionaire spent $14 million on FERRARI. Oh, they got the mark wrong. Half of them did that experts couldn't fix. Small-town mechanic did it in 6 days. The wrongness of the details didn't slow it down. The shape of it was the thing, and the shape was a fairy tale. The dead broke shop, the impossible car, the woman who'd flown in from her empire, and the man who'd thrown her out, and then quietly done what 23 teams of the best engineers alive could not. The internet ate it. Adrian found out about the camera crews the way you find out about weather. Her head of security called to say there were 2 news vans parked at the end of the gravel road in Halford, and a third trying to find Sam's school. That last part made her go cold. "Find out which school," she said, "and keep them off it, whatever it costs today." She called Cole. He didn't pick up. She drove. She was still in Ohio. She had not been able to make herself leave, and she found him standing in the yard looking at the news vans the way you'd look at a grass fire moving toward your house. "They're at the edge of the property," he said, not turning around. One of them asked Sam's friend's mom what school he goes to. "At the diner." In front of people. His voice was very even, and the evenness was worse than shouting. "I've spent 8 years making sure that boy's life is small and quiet and his, and it took one phone video to—" He stopped. He made himself stop. "I need to understand what's about to happen to us. You've lived inside this. I haven't." "Come sit down," she said. "Let me tell you what I know, and then I think it's time you told me the longer conversation, because they are going to find out who you are, Cole. They're going to dig, and I'd rather hear it from you so I can get ahead of it than read it tomorrow." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, and they went into the little office, and Sam was sent out to the yard with the dogs and strict instructions to count every spot on every ladybug in Ohio, and Cole Renner sat down across the desk from her and told her who he used to be. "My name's Cole Renner," he said. "Until 9 years ago, I was the lead powertrain integration engineer for a motorsport and restoration outfit out of North Carolina. We did development work." chassis, engine management, electrical integration for collectors and for 2 professional teams. Before that, I spent 4 years in Italy. Adrian went very still. Sant'Agata, she said, the town where they built the car sitting in his shed. For a while, he said, I was young. I was on the engineering side of the classic and heritage program, the people who keep the old cars alive, who know how the carbureted V12 cars actually breathe, not just how the manual says they should. The kind of modification your brother did to that Countach, a hidden security sequence built into the fuel and ignition so the car won't run for a thief. That was a thing a certain kind of obsessive owner did to these cars in that era, when they got valuable and got stolen. I'd seen it before. I'd helped defeat a couple of them the legitimate way for owners who'd lost the sequence. He looked at his hands. That's why I knew to look at it as a lock instead of a fault. I wasn't smarter than the 23 teams. I'd just seen this exact kind of love before, and they hadn't. Then why, Adrian said carefully, are you running a one-man shop in a town of 400 people when you could? Because 9 years ago my wife got sick, Cole said. The office was quiet. Out in the yard, faintly, they could hear Sam telling the dog something with great authority. Her name was Raina. He turned a cold wrench over in his hands, a small fidget. We met in Italy. She was a translator. She could move between 4 languages like changing lanes, and she thought my whole world of cars was the most beautiful, ridiculous thing she'd ever encountered. We had 3 good years. Then Sam came, and then about 8 months after Sam came, Raina got a diagnosis, and it was the kind there's no good version of. She fought it for 14 months. His voice didn't break, but it changed, went lower and more careful, the way a man's voice changes when he's carrying something across a gap. She was unbelievable about it, right to the end. She'd hold Sam and tell me what kind of man to raise him into. She had a list. She actually had a list. He set the wrench down. After she died, I couldn't do the work anymore. Couldn't. That world runs on travel, on 80-hour weeks, on being on a plane to a race or a client at 4 hours' notice. You can't do that and be the only thing a 1-year-old has left. So I left. I turned down everything. I went dark on every contact I had, and I came back here, to the town I grew up in, where the cost of living is nothing and I own the building outright because it was my own dad's shop before me. And I started fixing tractors and pickups and Mrs. Petrak's John Deere. And I raised my son. He looked up at her, and there was no apology in it, no self-pity, none of the defensiveness people have when they suspect their choices look like failure from the outside. People hear the story and they think it's a tragedy that a man with my background is fixing tractors in a junkyard, he said, and there was the faintest, driest edge on the word junkyard, and she felt it land exactly where he'd aimed it, and she absorbed it because she'd earned it. It's not a tragedy. I have breakfast with my kid every morning. I'm at every game, every recital, every spelling test. I have never once missed picking him up because a client 3 time zones away had an emergency. Grief reorganizes what's important. The title, the work, being the best in the room, it all stopped feeling like anything. Sam felt like something. Everything else was just noise I made to fill the time around him. Adrian thought about the breezeway she walked 11 extra minutes to avoid. About the house with 1 room she couldn't enter. About 7 years of failing to fix a car because she could not bear to actually grieve the man it stood for. You and I, she said slowly, have been doing the same thing in opposite directions. You walked away from everything to sit with your loss. I built a wall of everything so I'd never have to. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said. I figured that out about you somewhere around day 2. The press situation got worse before it got better, the way these things do. By Sunday, a car blog with a serious following, run by a former racing journalist who had real contacts in the industry, had found Cole's full history. The piece was thorough, and worse, it was fair, which made it impossible to fight. It laid out his years in Sant'Agata, his work in North Carolina, 2 patents with his name on them for engine management integration, a quote from an anonymous former colleague describing him as the guy who understood how the old V12s actually breathed, not just how they were supposed to run on paper. It noted, with what was either decency or legal caution, that he had left the industry after his wife's death and raised a child alone in his hometown. It did not name Sam. But it quoted a Halford neighbor who had not been asked not to talk and who, with total warmth and no understanding of what they were setting loose, described Cole as the best dad I've ever seen. Hands down, that little boy is his entire world. The internet, which had been waiting all weekend for the emotional payoff, arrived at it. By Monday, there were 2 fundraisers started in Cole's name without his knowledge or consent, collecting real money toward a man who had asked for nothing. By Monday afternoon, one of the big collector car auction houses had publicly, on its own social channels, offered Cole, a consulting role at a number that Adrian, who knew that world, could see was inflated by half for the optics, an offer that cost them nothing whether he took it or not, and bought them a news cycle of looking like the kind of company that recognizes talent. She found Cole in the shop, holding his phone with both hands the way he did when he was reading something that required real thought, the V12 ticking as it cooled behind him. Sam found one of the fundraisers this morning, he said. He thought it was hilarious that strangers wanted to give us money. He asked if we were famous. I told him no. He set the phone face down. He said the neighbor who talked to the reporter owes him $1 because he fed her cats last summer. Adrian laughed before she could stop herself. He's not wrong about the dollar, she said. Don't tell him that. I'll never hear the end of it. She helped him then the way she knew how. She had her communications director get the fundraisers taken down. It took days. Every time one came down, two more appeared because the people doing it genuinely wanted to help, which made it harder, not easier. She had her security keep the camera crews off the gravel road and, more importantly, off the elementary school. She drafted, with his sign off and to his exact specifications, a single short statement that used his first name only, confirmed nothing about Sam, named no school, and said simply that a man of significant professional skill had solved a problem that had defeated everyone else, and that she was grateful, and that the family's privacy would be appreciated. "Why are you doing all this?" Cole asked her at one point. "You don't owe me management. You paid me. We're square." "Because you found my brother," she said, and she watched the words surprise them both. "I asked you to find a fault in a car. You found him. You found his handwriting and his joke and the thing he hid for me to find someday, and you handed it to me instead of taking the credit, and you taught me to start it with my own hands when you could have just turned the key and impressed me. Nobody on earth has given me anything that large in 7 years." She paused. "And because I called your shop a junkyard, and I'd like the ledger to come out somewhere on the right side of that before I leave." He was quiet for a moment. "You're kind of intense," he said. "I've been told. Is it always like this?" "It gets worse," she said, "when I'm interested in something." She did not leave Ohio that week or the next. She told herself it was logistics. The car needed a few more days of shakedown. Cole wanted to run the cooling system hard and watch it. There were the press matters to manage from somewhere. All true. None of it the real reason. The real reason was that she had walked into a rusted shed at the end of a gravel road, expecting to fail for the 24th time. And instead she had found two things she had stopped believing existed: her brother's voice, scribed in brass, and a way of being around other people that did not require her to hold them at the precise distance she'd been holding everyone since the day they buried Marco. She started bringing coffee in the mornings. She learned that Cole took it black and Sam was allowed exactly half a cup cut heavily with milk. For ceremony, not for caffeine. She learned that the dogs were named Lug and Nut, which made her laugh out loud the first time, and that Sam had named them, and that Sam considered it the finest work of his life. She learned that the diner's pie really was better than it had any right to be, and that Mrs. Petrak had appointed herself the unofficial historian of the whole affair, and would tell the story to anyone, expanding it slightly each time, so that within a month the orange car in her telling had been given up for dead by the King of England's own mechanic. She learned the shape of a family that was not hers, and was letting her stand close to it anyway. One afternoon, watching Sam explain the entire taxonomy of beetles to a deeply patient Lug, she said to Cole, "He's remarkable." "He's his mother," Cole said simply. "She took up all the space in any room she was in the best way. He's got that. I was always the quiet one before her. She used to tell me I treated being invisible like it was a virtue." A small, complicated thing moved across his face, grief and affection, and the dry humor that survives them both. She'd have hated this shop, by the way, the mess. She'd have organized the entire parts wall in an afternoon and labeled everything in 2 languages. "My brother's shop was a disaster," Adrian said. "He knew where everything was and no one else ever could. I used to color code his invoices when I was a kid because I couldn't stand the chaos. He let me. He said a place should look like the people in it." She paused. "I built a company with 11,000 employees because I couldn't stand the chaos of being 11 years old and not knowing if there'd be a roof. And then I built a wall around the whole thing so the chaos could never get back in, including the people." Cole looked at her. "You know what the funny thing is?" he said. "You drove 2 states and spent $14 million to make that engine run, and the whole time the thing you actually wanted was the thing the engine meant. You didn't want the car fixed. You wanted to not be done with him yet." She didn't answer for a moment because he was exactly right and she hadn't known it in words until he said them. "He scribed run her hard," she finally said. "Marco, not keep her safe, not take care of her, run her hard." She looked out the dirty window at the gray fields. He spent his whole life being careful. He bought the most beautiful car in 3 counties, and he was too scared to drive it. He kept it in a storage unit. He treated it like it was made of glass. And then he left me a note that said run her hard like he knew. Like the last thing he wanted to teach me was the thing he could never make himself do. Sounds like he meant more than the car, Cole said quietly. She looked at him. He meant you, Cole said. It wasn't a question. The freight train's horn lifted, far off, the 4:20 right on schedule, and rolled across the fields and through the thin walls of the shed, and Adrienne Vance felt the sentence land somewhere deep and specific that she had kept locked for 7 years. Yeah, she said when she could. I know that now. She drove it for real on a clear, cold morning in late October, the kind of Ohio day when the sky goes high and pale, and the harvested fields run flat and gold to the horizon in every direction. Cole came with her. She hadn't asked. He'd simply walked out to the car in his coat and gotten in the passenger seat, and when she'd raised an eyebrow, he'd said, "You're about to take a 50-year-old Italian car with a sequence lock and 7 years of sitting onto a public road. I'm coming in case it strands you. Also because I don't know. It seems like the thing to do." Sam rode in the jump space behind the seats, technically against every rule of physics and safety, wearing sunglasses he declared appropriate for the vehicle, sworn to secrecy by his father, vibrating with joy. She did the sequence. Marco's sequence, her hands inside his hands. The dragon woke. And then Adrienne Vance pulled her dead brother's Lamborghini out of a junkyard at the end of a gravel road in a town that wasn't on the map, and drove it, actually drove it, down the long, flat county road between the gold fields with the windows cracked and the V12 filling the whole world behind her head. She drove carefully at first, learning it, respecting it. The steering was heavy and alive and talked to her hands. The pedals were a foot off center the way these old cars were built for someone else's body, and she adjusted, and after 2 miles she stopped thinking about her feet and started just driving. The road ran straight to the edge of the earth. There was no one on it. The grain elevator shrank in the mirror. "How does it feel?" Cole asked. "Like his," she said before she could engineer a better answer, the truest one available. "It feels like his." For a while no one talked. It was a comfortable quiet, the kind that doesn't need filling. Sam, behind them, watched the fields blur past with his sunglasses on and his mouth slightly open, and didn't say a word for almost the only time since Adrienne had met him. They came up on a long, empty straightaway, the road laid out flat and arrow-true for what looked like 3 miles, not another car in sight, the fields running gold on both sides. Adrienne looked at the road. Then she looked in the mirror at the boy in the sunglasses and then at the man beside her. "Marco never got to do this," she said. "He drove it twice in a parking lot, going maybe 15 miles an hour, gripping the wheel like it might bite him." Her hands flexed on the small, thick rim. "I used to tease him about it. I asked him what the point of having something beautiful was if you were too scared to use it." "What'd he say?" Cole asked. "He said some things are worth being careful with." She watched the road. "I thought he meant the car." She thought about the brass float bowl, 4 NESSA, run her hard. She thought about her brother spending $480,000 on a dream and then locking it away because he loved it too much to risk it, and dying before he ever let himself feel it open up, and leaving her hidden where only love would ever find it, the one instruction he'd never managed to follow himself. "He spent his whole life being careful with the thing he loved," she said. "And being careful didn't save it. He's gone anyway. The car sat dead for 7 years anyway. Careful didn't preserve a single thing." She put her foot down. "So maybe the point was never to be careful. Maybe the point was always to run her hard." And she opened it up. The V12 climbed and climbed. The carburetors Marco rebuilt with his own enormous hands, feeding the engine he'd guarded for her like a secret. And the sound went from a roar to something enormous and total. A sound that arrived in her spine and her sternum and behind her eyes. The sound a 14-year-old boy in Cordero, Colorado, had taped to the inside of his locker and dreamed about. The sound she had spent $14 million in 7 years and an ocean of refused grief to hear one more time. The gold fields tore past. The flat road poured under them. Sam, behind her, made a sound that was not a word, just oh, the sound of a child meeting something real for the first time and not yet having the language for it. She held it for 10 seconds, maybe 15. Her eyes were wet and her hands were perfectly steady. Then she brought it gently down and the world came back, the fields slowing, the engine settling to its deep idle, and she was laughing and crying at the same time, which it turns out a person can do. And Cole Renner was looking at her across the cabin with an expression she had not seen on anyone's face in 7 years. And from the back Sam said with total reverence, "That was the best thing that has ever happened to me." And Adrienne Vance believed him. because it was very nearly the best thing that had ever happened to her, too. They turned around where the county road T-boned into the state highway and drove back slower, taking it easy, nobody saying much, the dragon rumbling content beneath them. The grain elevator grew again in the windshield. The tracks. The rusted roof of the shed she'd called a junkyard, which she would never be able to call anything but Cole's shop again as long as she lived. When she pulled back into the yard and shut the engine off, the silence afterward was a different kind of silence than the one that had lived in her garage in Santa Fe for 7 years. Fuller, less like an absence, more like a held breath that had finally been let go. She sat with both hands on the wheel for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For coming." And she stopped, finding the accurate words instead of the easy ones, the way she'd learned to do in 6 weeks in Ohio. "When I thanked you the first day, I meant thank you for fixing the car. I don't mean that anymore. I mean thank you for understanding what it actually was, because you didn't treat it like a car. You treated it like what it was holding. Nobody spends 7 years and $14 million on a car. You knew that before you turned a single bolt." Cole was quiet a moment. "I knew what it was the second you told me your brother modified it," he said. "And the way you said was." She did not move to Ohio, and he did not move to New Mexico, because those are the clean ending stories tell, and this was not that kind of thing, not yet, and maybe never in exactly that shape, and both of them had been reorganized by loss too thoroughly to pretend a single good autumn rewrites a life. But she kept the plane busy. She funded quietly with his grudging, negotiated, written in detail permission, the reinstatement of every lapsed certification Cole had let go 9 years earlier, on his schedule, at his pace, with an ironclad clause that none of it could ever require him to travel during a school week. She did not offer him a job at her company. He didn't want one, and she'd have lost respect for him if he'd taken it. Instead, she did something that surprised her board and her biographers, and most of all, herself. She set up a foundation, small and unglamorous and real, that did one specific thing. It found people, mechanics, machinists, line workers, the people whose hands hold up the physical world, who'd had to walk away from the top of their field because life required them to, because someone got sick, because someone died, because a child needed them more than a career did, and it built them a way back that didn't punish them for the leaving. She called it the simplest thing she could think of. She called it Run Her Hard. The first time a journalist asked her what the name meant, she said it was a private thing and left it there. Some things she kept exactly where they were on the high shelf, the way Marco had kept a note in a coffee tin that she'd found at 12 and put back and never read and never would. You don't have to read everything. Some things you just have to know are there. The orange Countach did not go back to the glass garage in Santa Fe. She had it kept at Cole's shop. It made a certain logical sense. He could keep an eye on it, run it, maintain Marco's strange, beautiful systems the way only he knew how. That was the reason she gave. The actual reason was that the car had been dead in a museum of her grief for 7 years, and now it lived in a working shed full of life, where a boy could climb into the jump seat after school and ask his father 100 questions about gear ratios that his father answered in careful, calibrated, complete detail, and where, on Saturday mornings, a woman who used to take meetings on treadmills drove out to a town that wasn't on the map and sat on a stool and drank black coffee and watched 2 people who had let her stand close to them, and felt, for the first time since she was 11 years old and safe in a disappearing town, like she was somewhere she belonged. On a clear morning the following spring, Sam, who had turned 10 and who had announced his intention to become an engineer, but the kind that gets dirty, not the kind at a desk, asked Adrian if she would teach him the sequence, Marco's sequence, the password to the dragon. She looked at Cole. Cole looked back and gave the smallest nod, which she had learned was how he handed over the things that mattered most. "You learn how it works first," she told the boy. "All of it, every piece. Before your hand ever turns that key, you're going to understand exactly what your hand is doing and why. That's the deal. That's how my brother would have taught me if he'd had the chance." "That's the best deal," Sam breathed. "I know," she said. So that spring and summer, in a rusted shed at the end of a gravel road, with the freight train keeping time across the fields twice a day, a single father taught his son and a billionaire taught them both. And an orange Italian dragon got run hard, and run often, the way it was always meant to be. The way its first owner never let himself, and the way he spent his last act of love making sure his sister finally would. If you asked Adrienne Vance now what the Lamborghini meant, and people did ask, because the story never fully went away, she would think about all the ways to answer. The easy ones, the true but partial ones. The version the headlines told where a small-town genius beat the world's experts. The version that was actually true, which the headlines never quite reached. And she would say what she always said, which was this: the car was never about the car. It was about a man who loved her enough to lock the last thing he owned and hide the key inside it where only love could find it. It was about the difference between being careful with a thing and being brave with it. It was about the fact that for 7 years she had called the room where the car lived a place she couldn't enter, and had called a workshop full of life a junkyard, and had been catastrophically, expensively wrong about which one was actually full of dead things and which one was full of living ones. It was about how the most important doors in a life are almost never the ones you plan to walk through. Sometimes they're at the end of a gravel road you only drove down because you'd run out of better roads. Sometimes they belong to a man you insulted to his face, who threw you out, and who turned out to be holding, patiently, quietly, the whole time, the one thing you'd been searching the entire earth to find. She'd run out of better roads, and she'd turned the car around, and she'd gone back anyway. That was the whole thing, really. She went back anyway.